I have with us today Andrew Rudman, who is director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And it's from Washington he comes to us. Before joining the Wilson Center, Andrew was managing director of Monarch Global Strategies, a boutique strategic advisory firm located in Washington. Monarch focuses on government relations and market entry and access for companies interested in doing business in Mexico and other Latin American countries. Andrew managed Monarch's healthcare practice and supported clients across the range of sectors and interests. He also writes and speaks on Mexican healthcare policy issues. Mr. Rudman has a master's degree in Latin American Studies from Tulane University and a bachelor's degree in government and Spanish from Colby College. He is fluent in Spanish and has a working knowledge of Portuguese. U.S. relations with Mexico are vital. The countries share a 2,000-mile border with 55 access points. Bilateral relations between the two have a direct impact on the lives and livelihoods of millions of Mexicans and Americans. Ongoing issues include trade, economic development, education exchange, citizen security, drug control, migration, human trafficking, environment and protection, and climate change. The scope of relations between the United States and Mexico is broad and goes beyond diplomatic and official relations. It encompasses external, commercial, cultural, and education. And I'm so pleased, Andrew Rudman, to hand the floor to you. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Don, Mal. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to join you all this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about Mexico and U.S.-Mexico relations. As Don alluded to, there are innumerable issues that we could talk about, lots of different topics, and frankly, challenges facing our two countries that we should try to address jointly. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. I keep an eye on the clock so that we leave plenty of time for conversation. So I'll try to cover a lot of things, probably not in a great deal of depth, and then we can delve more deeply into whichever topics are most interesting to all of you this morning. But as Don mentioned, there really is no U.S. relationship that is more impactful on us on a daily basis than the relationship between U.S. and Mexico. And I think it's important to use that word impactful. A lot of times we get caught up in, the U.S.-UK relationship is our oldest relationship, or there's no relationship tighter than U.S. and Canada, and those are both true, I think. But in terms of impact on us on a daily basis, I think the U.S.-Mexico relationship really is number one in that scope. We have relationships and interaction in, as Don mentioned, a range of issues: trade, tourism, the entire border region, family and cultural connections, and also illicit trade of drugs and guns and other things of that nature. We have a 2,000-mile border, which creates overlapping security, family, and economic, environmental issues. Those of you who perhaps have visited the border on either side of the U.S.-Mexico border will know that the area really is deeply integrated, similar, Don, to the way the U.S.-Canada border is integrated, particularly in the pre-9/11 days when you could really go across the border almost at will. It's obviously a little bit more complicated now. We did, between the U.S. and Mexico, $650 billion in trade, so that's almost $2 billion a day. In 2021, Mexico was our #2 trading partner behind Canada. In January and February of this year, it has taken regain the #1 spot. Mexico, Canada, and China tend to alternate or bounce around which country is the top among those three. Pre-pandemic, we used to see over 1 million border crossings a day between the US and Mexico. And there are 37 million Mexican Americans, which makes it the largest share of the Hispanic population and about 11% of the total US population. So the relationship is longstanding, it's deep. Parts of what is now the United States were at one point Mexico. So folks out in Colorado and Utah and Arizona who have lived there for generations often say that the US came to them, which I think is a nice way to say that the US took the land that used to belong to Mexico. The state of the relationship, let me start there. President Biden, when he took office, really attempted to regularize the relationship, which historically had been quite broad and covered many of the issues I've already mentioned. Under the Trump administration, the focus truly narrowed to migration and trade. And then once the USMCA, the trade agreement was negotiated, it really became very transactional and very much focused on migration. The Biden administration came in trying to restore the institutional nature of the relationship, promote more cabinet level and sub-cabinet level interaction across the range of issues. There had always, prior to the Trump administration, been a tradition of not crossing silos, if you will, between the relationship, not, for example, mixing up a trade dispute with a security issue or a cultural issue. That didn't happen as much under the Trump administration. The Biden administration has sought to go back to that siloed approach where you argue over trade in trade and you argue over migration in migration, and you don't mix the two. The Biden administration has created or restored some bilateral and trilateral mechanisms that originated in the Obama administration, one being the high-level economic dialogue, which is a cabinet level exchange between US and Mexico. There is also a high-level security dialogue, which began last fall with the conclusion of a bicentennial framework to replace the Merida Initiative. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then President Biden, President Lopez Obrador in Mexico, and Prime Minister Trudeau reestablished the North American Leaders Summit, something that had not happened in the Trump administration. And each of these mechanisms really is an effort to address the numerous issues that we need to address in North America bilaterally or trilaterally, issues that really can't be resolved by one single country by itself. So let me go through a few issues, a few of the many we could talk about. I'll try to briefly talk about trade, migration, security, and then some issues that are a little bit of concern to some extent in Mexico that certainly folks in Washington are paying attention to. On the trade and economic side, which is I think where most people think about the US-Mexico relationship, and there is no doubt that the integration of our economies, as well as the US-Canada economies, are just so deeply integrated. Certainly my view that even if the free trade agreement went away, I think the integration would not have gone away. It would have been more expensive in some ways, but just too long established and integrated for it to go away. Since 1994, we've had virtually duty-free trade in North America. And not only do we have duty-free trade, but we make things together. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that it's not just a question of us buying Mexican avocados, for example, or maple syrup from Canada. It's putting things together and selling integrated products. About 40% of the content of things we import from Mexico, for example, is US content. In other words, it's an input that was produced in the US, sent to Mexico, assembled, and shipped back. It's about 25% for Canada, and no other country is even close. For China, it's about 3%. The two best examples to sort of demonstrate, I think, the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement and now the Mexico-Canada agreement are the auto industry, which I'm sure you're all aware of how deeply integrated it is. an auto will often, its parts will often cross the border up to 7 times before final assembly in one of the 3 countries. And this developed over a long period of time, preceding and then certainly during as a result of the NAFTA. The other, I think, best example of how NAFTA has impacted our lives is in the area of agriculture, where here in the States and in Canada, we have access to fresh fruits and vegetables year round, which was certainly not the case before NAFTA. And there's also been a lot of cross-border investment, a lot of US investment, some of the biggest US fruit and vegetable suppliers developing partnerships in Mexico and introducing new technologies, which adds to our access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Two-way trade in agriculture between the US and Mexico is $63 billion, which is a lot. Avocados are about 4 billion. Just to name one of the most commonly focused on products. The USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, is the renegotiated or the updated version of NAFTA. I think after 25 years, NAFTA having entered into force in 1994, it was pretty clear that a lot had changed. The world is obviously different than it was 25 years ago. And so I think it made sense to look at how to update the agreement. And of course, President Trump, who ran on a campaign that NAFTA was the biggest, the worst trade agreement ever, and that he would get rid of it or renegotiate it, really kind of forced Mexico and Canada to come to the table. It's not that either country hadn't been aware that there were issues that needed to be fixed. It really was a question of political will, because when, as they say, you open up a free trade agreement, if you open it up, you have to open all of it up. You can't just open one little piece. And so the most important thing really about the entry into force of USMCA on July 1st of 2020 is that it restored certainty. And those of you in the business community will know that certainty is the most important factor. Like companies, investors want to know that the rules that apply the day they make the investment will still apply many years later. So having a USMCA after lots of threats that NAFTA would be torn up, that we would pull out, et cetera, really was important. The agreement itself has some interesting and novel features. One of the most important is that the labor and environment chapters, which had been side letters under NAFTA, are now fully incorporated into the agreement. And what this means is that the dispute settlement mechanism applies to both of those chapters. The labor agreement also includes a rapid response mechanism to address accusations of labor violations and worker rights violations that's aimed particularly at Mexico, though in theory it could be applied against the US or Canada. It has been applied a couple times already successfully to lead to independent votes for union representation in Mexico. The USMCA also has a digital trade and e-commerce chapter. There was no such thing in 1993, so it of course was not covered in the free trade agreement. USMCA also created more stringent levels of, rules of origin, higher levels of North American inputs required to qualify for duty-free treatment under the USMCA. And that's significant. I think more than anything, it is significant because it's the first time we've ever had a free trade agreement that actually was more restrictive. Most of our, in fact, all of our free trade agreements prior to USMCA had open trade. This is an effort to shift manufacturing back to North America and try to make it more, frankly, more difficult to benefit from the trade preferences if you're not producing the inputs here in North America. USMCA also has a review process, which is novel. As I mentioned, after 25 years, NAFTA was stale, needed updates, but there really was no such mechanism. Now there is. There will be a review at 6 years, so in 2026. At that point, the 3 governments will either decide that everything is great, or they will identify issues that they think still need to be fixed. And then they will meet each year to discuss whether they have resolved those issues. The agreement ends after 16 years unless the 3 governments choose to continue it. So there will never be a situation again, as we had with NAFTA, of an agreement that's 25 years old and really with no way to update it. So that's USMCA. Let me talk a little bit. I mentioned the high-level economic dialogue, which is a bilateral effort by the two countries, really to focus on, as I think the Biden administration would describe it, some of the positive things that the two countries can do together in some of the areas where there is a commitment at the cabinet level and by the presidents, of course, who have endorsed this, to address certain challenges. The high-level economic dialogue has 4 pillars. One is building back together, which is a strengthening supply chain initiative. The two governments are looking particularly at certain sectors where they think there are opportunities to take advantage of the move now of reshoring or nearshoring or supply chain resilience, and all those words are used somewhat interchangeably, but essentially the move of production back from Asia to North America. The second pillar is called promoting sustainable economic and social development in southern Mexico and Central America. This is essentially the migration piece. It's the addressing the root causes of migration, why it is that people in the Northern Triangle of Central America feel, and Southern Mexico feel, compelled to migrate. Pillar 3 is securing tools for future prosperity. That's about telecom and ICT networks, really kind of the future. So there's, if you think about it, that's sort of the implementation or the execution as a result of the digital trade chapter of USMCA. And then pillar 4 is investing in our people, which is about workforce development. Lots of conversations at the government level and between government and academia and the business community and civil society. But how do we create an environment in which the workforce is available, that companies can hire people who are trained to perform the skills that are necessary. Often, if you talk to business, they say they hire people out of school and then they have to spend a couple of years actually teaching them the work that they want done. So all 3 governments are aware of this need, and I think the lesson so far, the most important lesson there, is the need to have that integration between the government and academia and the business community, so that the things academia is teaching are actually the things that the business community needs students or graduates to understand. One of the other big economic issues, probably the biggest economic issue right now between the US and Mexico, has to do with energy. President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has proposed some reforms to the energy and electricity laws in Mexico. These were changed in 2013 through constitutional amendments to open up the sector. As a result, there was a lot of foreign direct investment, particularly in renewables, and the proposed reforms that AMLO has presented that are currently being discussed in the Congress would roll a lot of that back. There are also some important challenges related to climate change and environment, which are obviously extremely important to the Biden administration. The shift that AMLO has proposed will lead to Mexico producing dirtier electricity, or using fuels like bunker oil or combustóleo, as it's known in Mexico. So you produce dirtier electricity, which will have an impact on companies that have global emission reduction targets, because if your production in Mexico is with dirtier electricity, you either have to find an offset somewhere else or you have to reduce your production in Mexico. So that's one of the most important economic issues at the moment. USTR TIE just recently sent a letter to Mexico saying that the US intended to defend its rights stringently under USMCA and the rights of investors. And it really was one of the strongest letters I've seen from a USTR, one of the most blunt letters I've seen. And this, over the past year, the US pressure has ramped up. The Canadians as well have been a lot more explicit, as have the Europeans and the business communities, about the risks of the proposed energy reform. Let me switch to migration, the other big issue that I know is probably on your minds. This is something, of course, that's been going on for For decades, people have been moving to the United States to work temporarily, if not permanently, for decades. There was the Bracero program back in the 50s, a guest worker program for for Mexicans coming to work in the United States. I think the challenge, I guess the first thing I'd say is the most important thing to remember is that when people choose to walk or spend their life savings to move 2,000 miles, whether it's on foot or bus or whatever, putting themselves and their families at risk, this is because it's a last resort. This is not something that people do on a whim. The people who you see the stories of the people waiting outside, literally outside the US border to get in, these are people who felt there really was no alternative due to the conditions in Central America and Southern Mexico. It's also important to keep in mind that lately the inflow of migrants or presumptive migrants has really come from all over South America and beyond. So it's not just Mexicans or Central Americans anymore. It's folks from Brazil, from Chile, from Haiti, from Cuba, from Nicaragua and Venezuela as well. I think the solutions are pretty well understood in Congress on both sides of the aisle. We need to have a clear process for regular and legal entry and exit into the country. We need, often call that a big wide door. But we also need to ensure that we know who's coming into our country, that there is appropriate security and appropriate monitoring so that we understand what's happening. A couple ways to do that would be to expand the H-2B visa program. This is temporary workers. It's capped now at 68,000 a year. I think the number of help wanted signs we see anywhere we go in this country suggests that we could allow more than 68,000 people in. That's the H-2B is non-farm labor. H-2A is farm labor. That is unlimited. And interestingly, I'm not sure if I'd thought of this before, many of you perhaps have not, but most of the produce that we consume in North America, regardless of where it was grown, is picked by Mexicans, whether they're guest workers, H-2As in the US, or guest workers in Canada, or obviously people in Mexico picking produce that gets shipped. So expansion of the H-2A process, particularly allowing for multi-year visas, would also be a way to address some of the demand for migration to the United States. Happy to go back and talk more about migration, but just in the interest of time on security, of course, lots of challenges between our two countries. Again, one of those issues that I don't think there's any way we could address the challenges of the drug trade and transnational crime organizations, money laundering, guns, et cetera. There's no way we could address that unless we collaborate with Mexico. There had been a program called the Merida Initiative established back in the early 2000s. That was a mechanism for US assistance to Mexico. Initially, it was equipment, but it really shifted to a lot of training and technical assistance, not so much just the transfer of heavy equipment. AMLO, or Lopez Obrador, was not a fan of Merida, and the US, I think the Biden administration, wisely renegotiated Merida. It's now called the Bicentennial Framework. Bicentennial because this year marks 200 years of diplomatic relations between Mexico and the United States. The Bicentennial Framework has three pillars: protect our people, prevent transborder crime, and pursue criminal networks. One of the most interesting features, I think, of this framework is it includes health, though specifically drug abuse, so not health broadly, but it recognizes that drug abuse is an issue that has to be addressed. I think, as you may be aware, there's traditionally been sort of an attitude of the producing countries and the transit countries, of which Mexico was one, that consumption is, the US demand, it's US demand that drives the production. And I think this is a recognition of a couple of things. One, that yes, to some extent, the fact that we have drug abuse issues here in the United States does, of course, create a market for illicit trade. But the Mexicans also have and need, I think, to a greater extent to recognize that there is now drug abuse in Mexico as well. Lots of concerns about synthetics, particularly fentanyl, which is either imported from China or some of the other synthetics imported, the precursor chemicals and then production in Mexico. That has led, it would appear, to reduction in the production of cocaine and marijuana as the cartels basically shift to a product that is a lot more lucrative, higher value for them, much tinier if you think about, the strength or the lethality of fentanyl, where just a couple drops can kill you. And you think about, transmitting that versus the volume that it would take, that say a pound of marijuana would occupy. So, security is always going to be an issue and a challenge for Mexico. AMLO came into office with a program called Hugs Not Bullets, sort of a reaction to the kingpin strategy of his predecessors, which ultimately did not work well. Hugs Not Bullets isn't really working either. There are lots of concerns about different estimates about how much of the country is controlled by the cartels. A lot of the violence is cartel on cartel violence. So there's no question, and happy to talk more about it, that Mexico needs to find a way to get control over territory and really find ways to attack the drug cartels. That's going to require the assistance of the United States. Another aspect of this is the U.S. is increasingly recognizing its responsibility to help Mexico, its drugs coming north, but its guns and cash going south. And we obviously collaboratively need to attack both of those sources of revenue and violence. I just quickly, before I wrap up, mention there are some concerns among many here in Washington and in Mexico about Mexico's democratic institutions under the López Obrador government. He has been very critical of the independence of institutions in the government that he sometimes seems to believe are attempting to thwart his ambition, his fourth transformation of Mexico. He's been particularly critical of the National Electoral Institute, which is the entity that runs all elections in Mexico. It's done federally, not on the state basis like here in the US. AMLO has been very critical of INE and has challenged its independence. In fact, he has a political reform proposal that would change INE, which are now the commissioners are nonpartisan, into a pretty clearly partisan structure where each party would nominate a slate and then the voters would choose who should be on the INE, who should be on the Electoral Institute. There are also some big concerns about press freedom and press violence in Mexico. Mexico is currently the most dangerous country not in a war zone for journalists. There have already been 8 journalists killed this year. And not differently, I don't want to say that murder isn't the most important thing, but differently, there are also a lot of attacks by the government and the government's supporters against journalists, challenging their independence. In one famous case, a journalist broke a story about one of AMLO's son's living conditions in Houston and questioning the propriety of where he was living. The president then attempted or obtained this person's tax returns and showed them on a big screen in his morning press conference and accused the journalist of being paid illicitly. Obviously a big concern. That's not the only example of those sorts of attacks. And also some attacks on academic freedom. Again, the same idea that academics who might suggest, might have viewpoints that are different than AMLO's, he brands as unpatriotic or neoliberal, which is sort of his catch-all insult for anyone who seems to not agree with his vision of where Mexico should go. This is a concern of NGOs and civil society groups in both countries, and increasingly a point that the US Congress raises both publicly and privately. Secretary Blinken has commented on attacks on journalists and the importance of ensuring their safety. So definitely an important issue. I think, though that's all is somewhat negative or discouraging, I don't think it detracts from the fact that we do have a incredibly deep, diverse, broad relationship. It is an essential relationship. And I think, the more issues that you talk about, the more different ways you engage, the more likelihood there is for conflict, but also for collaboration. I think that, a strategy of let's only talk about one thing because we won't have as many things to fight over. I think in the long term, that's not it's not the right solution. It's not the right strategy to resolve all the problems that our countries face. I've talked about, and Don mentioned some at the beginning, but just to reiterate, we have security challenges, we have climate change challenges, we have health challenges. I didn't mention COVID. It's probably the first time I've talked for this long without saying COVID. But that's another area where I think we need to learn the lessons of the pandemic. We need to see if we can do better next time. And that too will require collaboration between the US and Mexico, as well as Canada. So let me stop there with the formal remarks, and I welcome any and all questions and discussion.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow, that was great. And you did choose the hot button issues of trade and migration and opened up the discussion towards that. Towards the end of your presentation, you did introduce the subject of the current president of Mexico. And recently I watched a webinar in which a ex-foreign minister of Mexico spoke, and he was quite concerned about the way that the president was moving, as you told us about all these things that he's trying to change at one time. And during that, expressing his concerns, he mentioned that he thought the times were going back to the 1930s, where there were many problems between America and Mexico. So not being that old, I didn't know what was going on in the 1930s. So I looked that up, and it was the nationalization of the petroleum industry in Mexico that upset America, and of course all the petroleum producers in America, in the United States at that time. And I guess that in many things that he's trying to change now sort of are those kinds of issues as you told us a bit about. So I wondered if also I woke up this morning to the results of this referendum, so-called, in Mexico, in which we were told that the president got a 90% vote in his favor from the population yesterday. And I didn't know whether you wanted to comment on those two issues, or increase your comments about the kind of capitalism that America would like to see more of in Mexico, plus, of course, this referendum issue as to why, where, and what is going on in that country.
Sure, the AMLO, or Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the president, who's known by everybody as AMLO, he's a fascinating study. He is I think a brilliant politician. Really has a good sense of what the people are looking for. He's an excellent communicator, and used his decades of life as a politician, first in the PRI, which was the dominant political party for 70 years, and then in one of the leftist parties before creating his own party, to really tap into that frustration. He ran on a campaign in 2018 of First the Poor, and really talked about trying to address the challenges facing those who'd been forgotten by the system, and really argued that the current political system, the traditional political parties, the focus on an open economy, on sort of what he calls neoliberal policy, that all of that had not been good for the average Mexican. And it was a very effective campaign. He, in a 3-person race, he won an outright majority, which, as you certainly know, in Canada doesn't happen very often when you have more than 2 parties. And he made a lot of promises, including that he would have a referendum, a recall vote about 3 years into his term, in which the populace could vote on whether he should stay. AMLO is a big proponent of what he would call direct democracy, of having plebiscites or referenda to make big decisions. The recall yesterday required, in order for it to be binding, 40% participation, and it didn't even reach 20%. He did, as you mentioned, get about 90% of the vote. That's not really surprising, given that while voting is technically mandatory in Mexico, there's no real penalty. I think one of the interesting things, if you're sort of into politics and voter behavior, if you like AMLO, you're going to go vote for him. If you didn't like him, you faced a choice of, do you go and vote against him, or do you not vote at all to try to deny that 40% threshold? And you know, different people obviously would come to different conclusions based on the results. A lot of people concluded that there was no point. The interesting thing about this referendum compared to recall elections we've had in the States is that a recall election is usually driven by those who want to remove the person in office. This revocación de mandato was absolutely driven by the man in office to essentially obtain validation that he should stay in office. You know, some voters might have felt, I don't like him, but he got elected for 6 years. So in some ways, the way the question was worded was also played into this. But we could talk about AMLO for hours. So many different aspects of what he's doing and where how successful he has been or may be.
The other issue I was trying to introduce was the idea of the effect of capitalism, and he's complaining now that the U.S. is interfering with Mexico's energy bills that he's trying to put forward, and whether that's true or not, who knows?
Yeah, people often ask. I just got a call the other day asking, you know, is AMLO a leftist or is he a communist? I think my answer is he's very much a nationalist. I think he understands that capitalism is, and these would be more his words than mine, a necessary evil. I don't think he has a vision of eliminating private investment at all. In fact, he touts, anytime there is an announcement of a new investment in Mexico, he touts it. But there are certain sectors that he definitely believes belong to the people. You mentioned oil, that's obviously the biggest one. But he has now proposed to do the same with lithium, which there is a deposit in Mexico that would be the largest single lithium deposit in the world, were it able to be extracted safely and effectively. And he too sees that as something that is the patrimony of the state and should be managed by the state. When it comes to, for example, you know, if he wanted to invest to build a hotel in Mexico and employ a bunch of people, he has no problem with that. But he has announced several big projects, which are definitely public projects funded by the government and managed somewhat worrisome in a somewhat worrisome manner by the military. A new airport in Mexico City, a new oil refinery in Tabasco, his home state, and a new train line in Yucatan going into southern Mexico called the Tren Maya. Those are big, you know, sort of state infrastructure projects that might remind us of sort of the days of the Soviet Union. So he's definitely more statist, but not, I think to say he's opposed to capitalism is, which I know you didn't say, Don, would be an exaggeration, but he is definitely more wary of capitalism than past Mexican presidents. And I think that the big impact there is that while there were certainly differences of opinion between the US and Mexico since 2000, the first time that the PRI didn't win the presidency when you really had an open election, the successive presidents all had a vision of where Mexico should go and how it should get there that was pretty consistent with the view of the United States in terms of the growth through public sector support of private sector investment. And now you have a president in Mexico who does have a different view. And so that is inevitably going to create some areas of conflict or disagreement, including on the energy reform.
You explain things very well. It's a delight, actually.
Thank you.
To be in your audience. And now I'm going to ask my friend Mal, who leads us so adroitly and efficiently, to come forward with not only a view of him, but also his question of the day.
There are really two questions, both of which have to do with essentially the foreign policy issue going beyond US-Mexico. So for one of them, the same, I suspect the same webinar that Don referred to, one of the commentators talked about a growing leftist trend in Latin America and a statist trend in Latin America, and what was called the pink tide, where even in this time of great international upheaval, Latin America and even Mexico have been kind of ambivalent about the US or the Western relationship with Russia over Ukraine. Could you comment on that? What's happening? What's the nature of that? And does that not only impact US or Western approach, but does that also even impact whether or not Latin America can pull itself together as a, if you will, voting bloc or whatever it is you want to call that?
You know, I think there are a number of reasons, and broadly in Latin America in general, you know, there is long-standing anti-Americanism in not the sense that if you or I as tourists go, they don't like us, because that's not true. I think they like, but anti-American governmentism and a rejection, you know, a long history of US intervention in Latin America, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, support for military dictatorships, et cetera. So on the one hand, I think for many in the Latin America left, it's just a reflex to support Russia and therefore not support the side the US is on, but support Russia. For some leaders, and let me talk more specifically about Mexico, it's good domestic politics, or it was good domestic politics in some ways for AMLO to be seen as standing up to the United States, and also standing up for the concept of non-intervention. Obviously, huge conflict here. That, okay, you're saying you don't like it, you're non-interventionist, but the Russians have just invaded Ukraine and you're saying nothing. And there's no doubt that what López Obrador has said about Russia and Ukraine is different than what Mexico has said on the Security Council, where it's a non-permanent member, or what its foreign minister has said. But I think AMLO's foreign policy more broadly, so not just focused on Russia and Ukraine. AMLO is not really a foreign policy guy. He's more of the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy. But for his base, the anti-Americanism, the standing up to the Yankees, is still popular. So some of what he says, I think, is for domestic consumption. He's been very supportive of the Cuban government and very critical of US-Cuba policy, even in the midst of the pandemic, sending aid shipments to Cuba. He invited Maduro from Venezuela to come to his inauguration. I mean, he's done a lot of things that I think his domestic constituency likes, but I think are definitely sort of poking the US in the eye. I think the Biden administration largely understands where that's coming from, but I think, frankly, and I've written about this, that when AMLO pursues the policies he's pursuing, says the things he says, I think for those who want to argue that he is a leftist or he is a danger, this just reinforces that idea. And I think it makes it harder, limits the Biden administration maneuverability when the Republicans in the Senate can say you shouldn't be dealing with a guy who's a Cuba sympathizer or a Maduro sympathizer, or a guy, as you say, Mal, who seems to be on the wrong side here between Russia and Ukraine. Mexican trade with Russia is pretty limited. But some things have happened. They just started a Russia-Mexico Friendship Commission in the Senate, which was pretty appalling, in which Ambassador Salazar went to the Congress the next day and said, U.S. Ambassador Salazar said, you just can't do this. You can't do this right now. But again, that's presumably the legislature just kind of, we can do whatever we want. We're going to talk to the Russians. So I think it's really, I'm sorry, I'm sort of rambling. I think it's really, in a sense, it is problematic, but it is symbolically problematic. I'm not sure that at the end of the day, it's really going to change much about how the US and Mexico interact.
There are another pair of questions coming from our audience that have to do with oil production. And it's not a US-Mexico issue, it's a beyond that. And so one question really says, can Pemex, despite its reputation for inefficiency, boost its oil production and expand global supplies? And another question is about the same kind of a thing. Are they able to do things in a way that significantly affects the energy issues beyond the US-Mexico direct needs?
I mean, the short answer is no. Regrettably, they produce as much as they can, and their production has been declining over time. They really do need more international assistance, technical assistance, and support. And that was one of the things that the 2013 reform permitted. And I think it's would be important for Mexico to distinguish between who owns the oil or who owns the lithium and who extracts it. And sometimes I think the AMLO government conflates those issues. It is certainly possible that you could hire a major international oil company to dig the well, and then you keep the oil and you pay them for the service. And that would, had there been more of that, Mexico would be better positioned to capitalize. The truth is, right now they're pumping what they can. Most of it they ship to the US because they don't have the refinery capacity to refine it themselves. So Mexico exports oil and imports gasoline, which is a great frustration of AMLO, which is why he's building a big refinery in Tabasco. Some more expert in the field than I say that, there were smarter things you could do with that money than invest in a refinery. Would have been more productive to invest that money in technology or in Pemex's ability and just continue to export the oil and have it refined in places that already exist. So the short answer is no, they can't. And I think it demonstrates a lost opportunity for Mexico, but it's not something that, they can't tomorrow start pumping more.
There's a question from the audience here that under Trump would have been front and center in this discussion. But the question is, do you think the wall is serving any real benefit in dealing with immigration?
I don't think it serves any real benefit, particularly since most of the people migrating now are attempting to claim asylum. They're trying to claim an unreasonable fear of persecution, which means they want to be caught. They're not trying to sneak in, and the concept, of course, behind the wall is to make it harder to sneak in. Lots of stories in the press about how the wall really isn't as strong as it's supposed to be, and that people are cutting through it. And I think really what happens is the bad guys continue to profit. The human smugglers and the coyotes profit by knowing where to get through the wall, and those who don't think they're going to be able to make an asylum claim or don't want to wait through the process are paying them off. So in some extent, you've created, frankly, a market for illicit activity. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't patrol the border. We do. Border Patrol does, using other technologies, but I'm not sure that the barrier was really the right way to go about it, since people just go over it, under it, around it.
Yeah, an interesting question which has come from, to me, off the field is, talk a bit more. This is the questioner asking, Joyce Leonard. Talk a bit more about influencing Mexico's education to serve business interests. Couldn't this be conceived as another form of America's cultural imperialism, viewing education's purpose to only serve a capitalist model and not as education for education's sake?
That's a good question. I think you know, when we're talking about workforce development and the idea that companies, in order to hire people, they have to have skills. And so I think it isn't so much about interfering with Mexico's education system or saying, for example, that Mexicans shouldn't become philosophers or shouldn't study particular things. It's more a question of, if people want to have careers in industry and business, and if business wants to be able to identify people with the appropriate skill set, how do you make that happen? How do you bring academia and government and the business community together so that the people who want to have those skills can have them, as opposed to interfering or telling Mexico what to teach? And the same applies, the issue applies here in the US and in Canada as well, because if you talk to companies in any of the countries, including Mexican companies in Mexico, they find that people come out of school and they're really smart and they write well, but they don't know how to operate a particular kind of machinery that is necessary. So I think that's more the challenge, but it's certainly a fair question.
Yeah, more leading perhaps to a German model of training people in the industries that they're then going to move into would be wonderful in all three countries, I guess. The other one here, someone would like you to talk a little bit more about the trade with China, China-Mexico relations.
So China-Mexico trade is different than China trade with much of South America, where you know, Brazil and Argentina export a lot of primary products to China. Mexico, in many ways, is more of a competitor of China for low wage, low to mid-skill labor, more manufacturing. So in some sense, Mexico and China are more competitors. I mentioned nearshoring or reshoring. I mean, that's investment coming out of China, coming back to Mexico or the US. There's been some Chinese investment in Mexican infrastructure in a couple railroad projects a few years ago that did not go well for the Chinese investors. So I think China, maybe it's not that there's no investment or that there's no trade, but I think China, Mexico, as I said, they're more competitors. So it's probably not. I think when people focus or express concern about Chinese activity in Latin America, Chinese loans and the strings and such, I think that tends to impact more on South America than on Mexico. And some of that may be Mexico's proximity and integration with the United States. And some have suggested that while it isn't clear where the line is, there is some line that the US would draw about how much Chinese investment or activity in Mexico would be okay. And presumably that line is lower, if you will, than it might be in other places.
One of the other questioner would like you to expand a little bit upon the drug trade, supply versus demand, US demand and Mexico cartels supply. And not sure what Mr. Rudman said regarding drug addiction in Mexico versus the extent in the United States drug addiction problems.
I mean, much bigger problem here in the States, you know, 100,000 fentanyl deaths in the last year. Mexico doesn't have that level, but I think traditionally, I think what I tried to say is traditionally countries like Mexico, Colombia, where there was production and transit, tended to think of themselves as not being users. They were merely producing a product or shipping a product for somebody else. And increasingly, I think they're finding in Mexico that there are actually people who are addicted to drugs. The cartels often pay lower level workers for them in product, which they then either use or sell themselves. So I think the point I was trying to make is that increasingly, I think Mexico is recognizing that it too has a consumption problem. And I think what that does is change changes the conversation and changes the focus a little bit when you're not just saying, oh, why should we stop the drugs? You know, our people are getting killed just to protect you. I think you start to see, well, wait a minute, the drug trade is bad for us as well. And I think to his credit, that's one of the things AMLO attempted or would like to do. That's the basis behind his hugs, not bullets strategy, is that if you give people gainful employment and make them feel part of society, they are less likely to, or they're not as good targets for the transnational criminal organizations that are looking to hire people to be guards and mules and all those other low skill, kind of low bottom of the totem pole type jobs.
The other questioner has a question as to opposition to the present government and whether or not there is anyone emerging that could compete with the word AMLO. Sort of reminds me of someone knocking at your door and trying to sell you a brush or two or something of that nature. So I wonder how the president feels about the nickname AMLO from that perspective, because I'm sure many of us think the same way. Anyway, that was not the question.
Right. No, right now the opposition is pretty fragmented. The three major traditional parties, the PRI, the PON, and the PRD, have on several occasions at the state level run in coalition, and it really is a vote for us because we're not Morena, we're not AMLO's party, and that has been successful in some places, but not overly successful. It isn't clear. The presidential election will be in July of 2024. Right now, it isn't clear if there would be one or multiple opposition candidates. Morena, AMLO himself, his popularity is at or better than 60% in almost every survey, and has been for his whole term. He cannot run for re-election. There are probably at least 3 people in his party who are seen as the front runners to succeed him. If he really puts muscle behind them, given the fragmented opposition, I think the chances are pretty good that Morena wins again. You know, in the conversations I've had with people in both the governing party and the opposition, you know, I think it will be difficult for the opposition to run if the only thing they present is, we're not AMLO and you don't like AMLO, so vote for us, because the Morena candidate will say, you voted for us because you didn't like the traditional parties. They're offering you the same thing you rejected once before. Why would you go back? And obviously none of us knows exactly what will happen, but I think if you sort of think about how you would translate that into a US, local or a federal election, you'd see it's probably not very easy to win if your argument is, let's go back to the thing you've already rejected. So I think, again, if the opposition could coalesce around somebody who was credible, maybe they'd be successful. It also might depend on who the Morena candidate is. But you didn't ask, but if I had to bet today, I would say that Morena is likely to win again in 24. What I won't predict is who will actually be, who the Morena candidate would ultimately be.
Thank you, Andrew. As I said a moment ago, your lecture, your words, and your wonderful way of replying to questions has entranced us all. And, I do thank you for that.
Very kind of you to say.
I'm going to hand you back to Mal, who's going to close our session today. And we're so pleased that you are here with us, and we hope to invite you again one day. Thank you again. Appreciate it. Mal, over to you.
Many thanks to Andrew Rudman for his insightful and effective discussion today. Mexico is an important foreign policy subject, and he did a great job of conveying in a timely and complex subject. I know I gained a great deal, and even some of the things I've seen previously, he answered for us, even without our having to ask. Thanks to Don for hosting today, to Carrie and her staff at the library for the support that they've given us. Many thanks to our members who have supported us over the years and continue to join us. and participate wherever they are. We don't know what that is. On Monday, the 25th, we will host Robert Hormats, Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates, who will address an update on Afghan policy, another critical and timely subject. Until we meet again, please stay safe, please stay well.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you all. This was
Andrew
great.
Farber,
Thank you, everybody.
is back to you.
Thank you, Mel. Just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today and for such an excellent discussion. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.